Well, it's my pleasure today, on behalf of the National Charter School Founders Library, to be with Jim Barrett. Jim, you've been many things in your storied career, but one of them was you were the president of the Michigan Chamber of Commerce for a few years.
32 years with the organization for 37 and a half years. And my first job with them, I was hired from the state of Michigan, where I was a budget analyst in the Michigan Department of Education. And they wanted a new director of education research and analysis. And the idea behind all this was, as expressed to me, we'd like to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of K-12 education. And it was pretty much left open as to what that course that might take. And it would really be up to me. So that's how I got my start with the Michigan Chamber, and worked entirely in the education field for about 3 years, and then moved up the ladder in the organization and became the president at 32, about 4.5 years after I had been hired there.
Well, I bet a few people would get a smile to know that you started at the Michigan Department of Education.
I'm sure they would, and prior to that I'd worked for the Michigan Department of Treasury in the old Municipal Finance Commission and had the responsibility for approving school bond millage applications and just general school-related funding.
So lots of people think of the Chamber as a business organization. Why were you so passionate about education?
Well, at that point, and that would have been the early 1970s, business people were becoming very concerned about the cost of education, about the effectiveness of K-12 education, whether it was young people coming into the workforce or going on to college and university, and felt that there needed to be some improvements. And the response of educators was always, give us more money. And that's counter to what business people do every day. And they felt that there needed to be some competition in the education marketplace, which clearly there wasn't, except for independent schools at that point. And so they called upon me to try and come up with some suggestions and recommendations on how we might improve K-12 education.
So tell us a little bit about your formation. Where'd you grow up? What was it like growing up, and what led you into business and service, and ultimately part of your legacy is what you've done for education?
I grew up in the Lansing area, attended public schools, got an associate degree from Lansing Community College, a finance degree from Michigan State University, and worked some in construction, worked 2.5 years as an hourly employee at Oldsmobile Division of General Motors, where I became very familiar with the union movement, and was somewhat surprised to find how unions had such control over education once I got more involved in K-12.
So one of the things that we want to focus on is your role at the Michigan Chamber. And again, we think of the Chamber as a business organization, but you were talking 1971. Michigan's charter law didn't pass until 1993. What was going on in education that the Chamber specifically got involved with in those kind of 20 years precursor?
Well, to start out, one thing that became very clear, the education in K-12 was controlled by the teacher unions, specifically the MEA and to some degree the Michigan Federation of Teachers, as it related to anything legislatively. They also had allies in each community in terms of the Superintendent's Association, the School Principals Association, and various other education-related groups. So if you wanted to get anything done, at that time it was pretty much accepted. As far as education is concerned, the one interest that you had to get by was the Michigan Education Association. They had an active political committee. They endorsed candidates. They were very involved in the legislative lobbying process, and they had a lot of influence, perhaps more so than any other labor organization or interest group at that time. And one of the things that came out of that for me as I assumed greater leadership responsibilities at the Michigan Chamber was we had a lobbying corps at the Michigan Chamber, mostly lobbying on business issues. We had no political action committee or the ability to finance and support candidates who shared our point of view. And I decided right then that, you know, we're going to have to change the way we operate as a chamber, and actually utilized a lot of the information and experience that I had with the Michigan Education Association as far as trying to develop and become a more influential voice.
So you're emulating the MEA.
To some degree, in terms of being involved politically and having an impact on government policy.
You described that group of stakeholders, and sometimes we call them the status quo or the system. I remember the Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, called them the blob. Was that your experience?
My experience in the way that I labeled them was no change agents. And by that I mean, in terms of anything that you wanted to get done in education, they pretty much had legislated, or in the case of our Constitution, the so-called Parochiate Amendment, and it was pretty hard to make changes. So in the initial years, when I was directing the education-related program for the Michigan Chamber, we ran into a roadblock on any legislative efforts, for example, changing the tenure laws. And what we primarily focused on was how can we get some competitiveness into the education system. And the first layer of opportunities included transportation services, janitorial services, food services. Those were pretty much staffed by employees of school districts. And they were in many cases, of course, unionized, many of whom might be members of the Michigan Education Association, even though they weren't directly involved in teaching. And so we tried to publicize the opportunity for cost savings and improving efficiency through the contracting of public services. And if you look back at the early 70s, there was hardly any contracting for such services. We did an analysis and pointed out how many of the programs relating to food service, janitorial, and so on were hired as school employees, and pointed out these are great opportunities. And lo and behold, we publicized that information, and today you'd find, I'm sure, an overwhelming majority of services in those areas are actually contracted out to private contractors, freeing up the education administration to the more important issues of trying to better do a job on educating our students.
That's a great example of change. And one of the things we try and highlight through the Founders Library is how do ideas actually lead to change? And at that time, you're so right? The school systems ran everything. In that change, and I remember a few of the superintendents that went first to, quote, privatize that. And now I think almost all of them have gone to that better, faster, cheaper.
Yes.
Which we might attribute to a business mentality or just simply a mentality of excellence, right? How do you deliver better, faster, cheaper service so that you can spend more money on the kids' education?
Competition always works. Better services, lower costs, and that's simply a good business concept that was interjected into the school systems. So
I know it's been 30 years, but I want to take you back to the passage of Michigan's charter law. And so if we set the situation, it was 1993, John Engler's governor, and Proposal A is a big deal because then Senator Debbie Stabenow said, let's eliminate Michigan's school financing system, and they took her up on it. And all of a sudden, Michigan was home as a state to no school financing, and that had to be solved. Can you remember what was happening in those days?
Well, first of all, as it relates to this situation of eliminating property taxes for school finance, it created an opportunity. an opportunity for change. And there's lots of ways to look at difficult situations. If you look at them as opportunities for change, as Governor Engler and a lot of others did in the political process and organizations like ours did, then you can get something done.
Yeah.
And it helps to have the political wherewithal, but also the votes to bring about change. In 1991, the Michigan Chamber set up a group called Michigan Business Leaders for Education Excellence. And one of the early on things that we did was pointed out the disparities in school districts throughout the state in terms of test scores, in terms of the amount of money spent, and various other factors. And what was clear is no matter how much money was spent, in many cases, it was the quality of leadership within the school, the teaching staff, and you could get outstanding results in some cases in school districts that had relatively low expenditures from areas that were viewed as disadvantaged. So we started publicizing that information to make the point that you can improve education without necessarily just increasing funding, which was always the approach that educators wanted to take. And that sort of set the stage, I think, for a desire for better results, more efficiency. One of the interesting things that we ran into was even though the state of Michigan did testing on at the local school district basis, on a building basis, and that information was available, the educators didn't want to publicize it. And we went to the superintendents and said, hey, why don't you publicize this information in your local media? And as an organization, basically they said no. And so we went out and raised some money to run ads in many of the local urban newspapers in particular, and some smaller rural areas that had a list by building of test results. And that's how we started getting publicity about the results of schools. And fortunately, in the future, we didn't have to do that because there was so much interest and demand on the part of the media and parents that they started publishing that information. Now, we've kind of gone away from that more recently, but that was how we got out information about the performance or lack thereof of public schools, which sets up a situation where it's easier to bring about change if people see, hey, we're not necessarily doing as well as we should.
I find that story fascinating for so many reasons, but one of them is before charters, there was only one provider of public education in a geographic boundary, right? The district, right. And that was the district.
Yeah.
So your choice was to pay private tuition or to move to a better district. And all of a sudden with the advent of charters, you've got some choice. It's good to have some data to make those choices with.
Absolutely. Well, we had a situation with traditional public schools where if parents were dissatisfied, the wealthy ones could move to a better district. Those that were not wealthy were probably stuck with the existing system that they were in, and you didn't have the choice at that point to send your kids out of district if you desired, or to charter schools as an example.
Yeah.
So that new law just opened up so many options for student achievement and for parents to make choices about where their kids went.
One of the things we've seen through interviewing the founders is this notion that it's one thing to pass a law, it's another thing to implement it and make it work. And you've got so many ways that you've stayed on beyond the advocacy and passage of a law to making it work. And so I want to take you to a big one, which was Michigan's charter law passes. You guys helped advocate for that, get the votes, get it through, and all of a sudden it's found unconstitutional in circuit court. It's found unconstitutional in the Court of Appeals. And as the story has it, most people were ready to give up at that point, but not Jim Barrett in the Michigan Chamber. Can you pick up the story there?
Well, as you just indicated, we lost at the lower level courts Circuit Court, Court of Appeals, and a substantial amount of money was spent. And you had all the education groups challenging the law. And we were in a situation where, having 2 losses, the only option was to go to the Supreme Court. And there was a significant additional cost involved in going to the Supreme Court. The Dykema law firm, specifically Richard McClellan and Lynn Wolf, had done a wonderful job from a legal standpoint in laying out our arguments. They needed more money in order to pursue this, and we had to make a decision. Were we going to allow the educational community, the Michigan Education Association, American Federation of Teachers, superintendents, school principals, and so on, were we going to allow them to kill charter schools through the courts? And I was a little uneasy about our prospects, to say the least, after 2 lower court losses. And John Engler, governor, and Richard McClellan convinced me that this was doable. They just needed more money. Well, long story short is we negotiated an agreement with the Dykema law firm for a cap on expenditures, given they had already made a significant investment, and decided to go forward and test this before the Supreme Court. And I do remember going out to the business community and attempting to raise money, and we were successful. But it was a very difficult situation to convince business people that you've lost twice and you're going to win now, and can you guarantee this, Jim Barrett? And I said, well, there are no guarantees. If we don't win this, we're back to round 1. And fortunately, the court case was successful. Charters were maintained, and today we've got a booming charter school segment that has served kids so well in so many areas of our state and really throughout the United States.
Well, on behalf of so many people that have benefited from that choice, thank you for standing strong and going up to bat with 2 strikes and hitting a home run.
Well, I do want to emphasize that through all of this, there were a number of other players from the business community that were involved and were very supportive, especially in the legislative process. And I'm talking about the National Federation of Independent Business, the Small Business Association, the Michigan Manufacturers Association, and frankly, one of our staunchest allies was the Michigan Association of Realtors. And without their support, a lot of this wouldn't have happened either legislatively or certainly through the courts. One other thing that comes to mind as we were trying to develop support for charter schools was I'd been, as many others had, in some of the high-performing traditional school districts, particularly down in southeastern Michigan. And we'd always heard about there's this school that's a charter school in Houston, and that everybody needed to go and see that. And so I worked out an arrangement where we chartered a plane out of Detroit Metro Airport and had to give so much of a guarantee to cover the costs of the trip. And I don't remember how many passengers that was, but we sold out the plane. And one of the people that we were able to have go along on the trip was J.C. Huizinga, who now has over 100 charter schools. And anybody that went on that trip, and it included educators, business people, some legislative staff, I think was really impressed. And there are some things that stand out in that experience. One is that we went into this school, we first met with a principal, very impressive guy, and then we started going into the classrooms. All the student girls were dressed in nice dresses and all the same, and the boys wore pants and a shirt, all the same. but the enthusiasm that these kids had in the classroom and the enthusiasm their teachers had was just unbelievable. And they were learning, and they were bright and shiny. And one class that I remember going into, and I think it was the latter part of the day, was a 5th grade class that was focused on literature, Macbeth, Shakespeare. And you had these kids quoting, and then the teacher asking them questions about what they had read and what they had quoted on. And I was thinking to myself, I was in high school, probably my senior year, in English literature, sleeping through the classes on these subjects, and didn't know half as much as these 5th graders did. And after we finished, we had the opportunity to meet individually with teachers. And I made the decision to go outside and watch these children as they left school. And I was trying to get a sense for what kind of community did they come from, and their parents and others were picking them up, old cars, not such great clothing, clearly not even middle class. And these kids had a future before them that you could just see in their eyes and feel in your heart because of that opportunity to go to this school. And I think anybody that went on that trip, including some of the traditional educationists, came back saying, wow, we can do better. And charter schools have offered us that opportunity. And I think experiences like that help set the stage for the political environment to change and for legislation to come about with charter schools.
It's such a powerful experience when you see the love and joy of learning.
Oh, absolutely.
And engaged students that are like eager and ready to learn.
Right.
That's powerful. So that's the J.C. Huizinga's on that plane, sees Thaddeus Lott in action, and comes back and starts Excel Charter Academy in Michigan.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness for people like J.C. and others that made the investment, went through all the regulatory framework to establish these alternative opportunities for kids, and we're all blessed by that.
Well, the road's never easy, right? So the
Right.
law's passed, you get some people excited, we go through this court situation. I remember working for the Michigan Association of Public School Academies, MAPS is, the charter association in the day, and I had 2 press releases. One is if the court ruled it was unconstitutional, and one if it was a go. And I was on the street on Allegan, and I got the call that the court had ruled the law constitutional. And I'll never forget running to the office, turning on the fax machine, and doing a fax blast to get the member alert out that the law was constitutional. It was an amazing time.
It was exciting.
Let's talk about President Bill Clinton, because John Engler was a force in his own right. But here he invites President Bill Clinton to come to address a joint session of the Michigan legislature where a Republican and Democrat are standing arm in arm talking about charter schools. And I think President Clinton at the time said he wanted 3,000 across America. What was that like? What was the experience to see that type of bipartisanship?
I was invited by a legislator to sit at his chair on the floor during this presentation by President Bill Clinton. And it was really heartwarming because here we have a Democrat and a Republican in leadership roles saying we need more charters. And it was very well received even by Democrats at that time. There was much more bipartisan support for charter schools and alternatives in education than perhaps there is today. But that made a difference. It sets the climate and makes it easier for people to vote and for people to support an alternative method.
Through the Founders Library, we've talked to a lot of policymakers, and after they leave office, they look back and reflect on their time and the initiatives that they led and where they're at today. And it continues to amaze me that so much of what they work on comes and goes, gets undone, changed. But the charters become a legacy piece because there's a constituency, there's real schools, real kids, real educators, and families and communities that just are on fire for what that's done for their children. Can you talk a little bit, when you look back, you've been involved in so many things, 32 years at the Chamber as the leader, 37 as all in. What are some of the things that you look back on and say, they rank as big accomplishments that have stood the test of time?
There are a number of business-related issues. I think the whole charter school movement and the success is one of the personally most gratifying aspects of my service at the Chamber. And that's not to minimize at all the things that we did on the business front. But clearly, the change in young people's lives and education is going to make a long-term difference. I'm always going to be committed to improving K-12 education. Currently serve in roles with the Institute for Charter Schools, with the Mackinac Center, with the Great Lakes Education Project. And most recently, going back, I guess it's been over 10 years ago now, as I was chairman of the Great Lakes Education Project, which is an advocate for choice in education, we, along with MAPSA and several other statewide organizations, were successful in eliminating the cap on charter schools. And it's always been, as it relates to education, the traditional educationists, the no change agents, as I call them, are trying to limit choice and opportunity. And so we had quite a battle in the legislative process over eliminating that charter school cap. And what that does is offer up more opportunities for charter schools and students to attend. And that was a very gratifying part of my career activities, then retired serving in a volunteer role. Special credit has to go to elimination of that charter cap to then Speaker of the House Jase Bolger and then Senator Phil Pavlov, because those guys really made a difference in both of their caucuses in getting the votes for eliminating that cap under overwhelming opposition from the educational community.
Well, a lot of good people had tried to lift that cap before, including Governor Engler in a call of the Senate, if I remember, and couldn't get it done. So It was an obstacle, and the cap's got a long history because it used to be, I believe, 100, and then it went to 125 and 150, and then there was a smart cap, and then finally it was eliminated. But it was really seen as a way to not limit opportunities for parents and families.
It was a hindrance to greater opportunities and to choice in education. And with that eliminated, what we have to do is be sure that we maintain a political and legislative environment that is supportive of educational choice. And we need to continue to publicize the benefits of education choice. And if one looks at test scores, dropout rates, and so on, there's a good case to be made for charter schools.
Well, sometimes when I try and be funny, I say to people, there's this awesome idea about a substantially deregulated public school, and it's called a charter, and it'd be great to try it.
Yeah. Because
the reality was they were never freed from all the rules and regulations, and over time they keep getting added to. But it would just, the advocacy and the leadership that you and the Chamber have exhibited has been phenomenal. Talk a little bit about your reflections. 30 years, no law to a law, the first school to now. Michigan has 300 schools serving 150,000 students. And that doesn't mention all the charter school graduates that have gone through. What is that like to see that type of change in motion?
In the case of education, it's really dynamic.
Well, because you said it's been the no change agents, right?
It's just been a pleasure to see it and to see so many young people and their families benefit. And I think the future looks good for charter schools and choice, especially given some of the things that have happened, like with COVID, the closing down of schools. In many cases, charter schools stayed open, served their students. Parents want that alternative.
You know, it seems like our society, the speed of change and innovation and technology is just speeding up. And one of the arguments against the no change agents, if you will, is that they're slow to change and that their structure makes them very, well, not nimble and flexible and adaptable. Part of the idea is that charters would be responsive and flexible and adaptable. Are you seeing that play out?
Absolutely. Now that they have the opportunity for growth, they're growing, they're serving their constituency, and they're drawing people, young people, into their schools, and their parents are supportive. So I just think the future is bright for charter schools, no matter what political forces try to hold them back. It's part of our education fabric now, and I'm hopeful that charter schools will continue to grow. And if they do, as has happened in the past, it should relate to better performance by the traditional public schools, or the traditional public schools lose students to charter schools and ultimately go out of business.
Well, that's part of the theory, right? Choice and competition make things better. And
Right.
you were trying to bring choice and competition into education that to that point had been a monopoly. Is it playing out? Is choice and competition making everybody better? Is it the rising tide that lifts all boats?
It is in everything else. Why not education?
If we go back to that era, one of the things Governor Engler was always talking about is the smart state, the smart state, the smart state, that smart states would win the competition. When you think back to that, how important were schools to making an attractive business climate to attract, recruit, retain businesses to the state of Michigan and its economic prosperity, not to mention the education of its children?
If you look at any economic development efforts at the local level or even at the state level, if you look at home sales and what realtors say about moving to a particular area or community, there's one issue that's always at the forefront. What kind of education do you provide in these communities and or your state? So I think from an economic development standpoint, education has been crucial in the past. It's going to be crucial in the future. And let's just take today's situation in 2023. It doesn't matter what kind of business you're in, whether you're looking for service workers, construction workers, high-tech workers, there's a shortage. So those states that are doing a good job of competing with their educational systems are going to be advantaged in terms of providing the workforce that's prepared to serve whatever constituency the business is serving, and that's the future. Good education leads to good economic development. You can't have successful economic development with a good K-12 and without a good K-12 and higher education system.
Jim, with what you've done with your career in business, education, helping drive change for the betterment of all, what would you say to your current business leaders, right? What should they keep their eye on? What would you advocate for them to push for? How should they be thinking about the future and what they can do?
There needs to be a focus on less reliance and less government regulation. The focus needs to continue to be on competition and choice. And it doesn't matter whether it's education or just generally speaking. And our future is going to be dependent upon keeping government to the extent possible out of our lives and having a well-educated public who can make their own choices in their best interests consistent with the national interest.
What would you say to a student studying at Michigan State University and they're deciding, do I go into education or I go into business?
I would say to them that currently you may have the best opportunity for a wonderful professional experience, no matter whether you choose education, government, the private sector, because we don't have enough workers that are skilled and qualified and committed to an employer and to serving whatever that employer's public is. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for somebody that's thinking about going into business. We all experience some of the challenges, whether it's getting some home things fixed, or whether it's our automobiles, or you name it. An entrepreneur who comes in and provides outstanding service and a product has as great an opportunity today as I've ever seen in my lifetime.
You know, I want to just go back to a spot that we've talked about, but I want to hit it head on. You know, we talked about this cap limiting opportunity, but ironically, the cap was only on the state universities. It wasn't on the local districts. It wasn't on the intermediate school districts. It wasn't on the community colleges. It was only on the state universities. Michigan was the first to have a university charter a public school in the United States. How important strategically were the universities to taking this new idea and making it go?
The universities were critical to the development of charter schools. Just look at it from a local district standpoint. We've talked about the no change agents, the superintendents, the school boards. Are we going to count on them for the growth in chartering opportunities? If we do, it's very limiting. With the university boards, there was a much greater opportunity for diversity in charter schools and for authorizing of charter schools. The key going forward as it relates to the university is that we've got to have folks on the university boards that are committed to charter school development. We've come too far in Michigan, and I hope we aren't going to step back because of changes that might take place in the membership of the university boards.
Jim, Michigan moved in your career from kind of a complicated in-state, out-of-state tax formula for funding schools to a per-pupil foundation grant, which essentially meant the money would follow the student and that each student would be funded equitably. Can you talk us through what was happening there and what impact do you think that has had on actually propelling school choice?
If we go back to the early 70s, there were great disparities in the property tax bases to fund local schools from one community to another. And so you had great differences in the expenditures that were made in one school district vis-a-vis another. And I think by going to the per pupil grant, which was very calculated and which we knew we wanted to get to, was that the money follows the student. Totally different concept than funding a school district, basically.
So fund students, not systems.
Exactly, exactly. And so it gives a much greater flexibility, whether it's a cross-district student movement, or whether it's just in general, somebody wants to have the money to be able to go wherever they want to go. So it's been a remarkable benefit and has changed the whole dynamic of student choice and the success of charter schools.
So from a business standpoint, right, better, faster, cheaper, the charters have always gotten, really for political reasons, less funding than district schools, typically 30% less funding. No funding for facilities. Was that a good thing because it made them more efficient, or was that a bad thing because it was a political attempt to keep them from growing and being able to serve kids?
Well, it was clearly a political attempt for stopping or limiting the growth of charter schools. And I think under ideal circumstances, there would be more equity in charter school funding and traditional public school funding. What this situation has demonstrated, I think, is that you can do better with less in terms of K-12 education. And it just shows that the traditional public schools have not effectively spent their money in comparison to what charter school operators have done. So I think it's pointed out the great disparity in operations. I wish that there would be a little less disparity in the level of funding between charter schools and the traditional education community. And as charter school populations grow, hopefully there will be a political and legislative support for creating greater equity in the funding mechanism.
Well, that reminds me, you were appointed by Mayor Dave Bing and Governor Rick Snyder task force to try and solve Detroit's educational challenges. Can you just take us back and walk us through how that worked?
It didn't work very well because in the case of the mayor and many that were involved, they didn't want to hear about some of the suggestions that we made because it would have upended traditional education. So it was a valiant effort. You were involved in trying to provide information and analytic support on that effort. We just weren't successful.
You win some, you lose some.
That's right.
But you've never quit. Any final reflections?
Well, I'm just pleased with the improvements that are taking place primarily through choice in education. I think we have a long way to go. One of the challenges clearly is we've got population growth that is slowing. We're going to have less students in the future. I look at all these traditional public schools, the facilities that they have. How do you repurpose those facilities when you have declining populations? And then the traditional public schools have the challenge of charter schools and other options. How do we adequately fund the charter school operations on a more equitable basis so that they can survive and continue to do a good job? I don't see a particularly positive outlook for traditional public schools. I do have a very positive outlook for charters and choice and independent schools.
I used to use the analogy that the districts are like an aircraft carrier and it takes a long time to move them. And the charters were like speedboats and they could turn on a dime. And boy, with the pace of change that we're all facing, it's going to be important to be nimble and stable. Jim Barrett, on behalf of countless numbers of Michigan educators and students and families, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the Chamber's steadfast leadership. And I can tell you've got a gleam in your eye when you talk about this stuff. So I think you're going to do more before you retire out of being an education reformer. So,
the good Lord willing.
On behalf of the National Charter School Founders Library, thank you for your time and thank you for your service.
Thanks for the opportunity.